At 4 a.m. on a Monday morning in June of 1866, a woman named Margaret O'Brien rose from her bed in a small farmhouse outside of Philadelphia. The house was still dark. The fire in the kitchen hearth had gone out hours earlier. She did not light a lamp. She had done this so many times that her hands knew the work before her eyes could see it. She pulled on a wool dress and walked barefoot across the cold wooden floor to the kitchen. She had 3 children still asleep in the loft above her. Her husband would be up by 5 to 10 to the livestock, but this was not his work. This was hers, and it would consume the next 14 to 16 hours of her life. Margaret built the fire from ash logs and kindling she had split herself the previous autumn. She filled the largest cast iron pot she owned with water drawn from the well behind the house. It took 6 trips with a wooden bucket that held about 3 gallons each. The pot held nearly 20 gallons. She set it over the fire and waited. By 5:30 a.m., the water was beginning to steam. She did not have a thermometer. She judged the temperature by dipping her elbow into the water, the same way her mother had taught her. If it was too hot to keep her elbow in for more than a few seconds, it was ready. The laundry had been sorted the night before. White cotton shirts and linen sheets went first, colored cottons and woolens second. Heavily soiled work trousers and rags came last. Margaret lifted the first load, the whites, from a wicker basket and lowered them into the steaming pot. She used a wooden paddle to push the fabric down into the water. There was no detergent as we know it. She used lye soap that she had made herself from rendered fat and wood ash. It was harsh on the hands and stronger than anything sold in a store. She rubbed the soap directly onto the fabric, working it into the collars and cuffs where the dirt was heaviest. Then she returned the fabric to the pot and let it boil. This was not a gentle wash. Boiling was essential. It killed lice, removed body oils, and broke down the grime that accumulated from a week of work in fields, kitchens, and factories. But boiling also weakened the fibers. A good cotton shirt might last 2 years if it was washed carefully. If it was boiled too long or rubbed too hard, it could tear after 6 months. Margaret had learned this balance the hard way. She had ruined 2 of her husband's best shirts in her first year of marriage. Her mother-in-law had not let her forget it. By 7 a.m., the sun was up. The children were awake. Margaret's oldest daughter, aged 9, was sent to the garden to pick greens for the midday meal. The youngest, a boy of 4, sat on the kitchen floor with a piece of bread and watched his mother work. Margaret did not stop. She lifted the whites from the boiling pot with the paddle and transferred them to a second pot filled with cold well water. This was the rinsing stage. She stirred the fabric with the paddle, then lifted it out and carried it to the washboard. The washboard was a rectangular wooden frame with a corrugated zinc surface. Margaret knelt on the floor and placed the board at an angle in a shallow wooden tub. She took one shirt at a time, dipped it in the rinse water, and rubbed the wet fabric against the ridges of the washboard. This was the most physically demanding part of the process. Each shirt required dozens of passes, up and down, pressing the fabric hard against the metal. Her knuckles were raw by the time she finished. The skin had cracked and bled many times before, but it had calloused over the years. She did not feel it anymore. At 8:30 a.m., the whites were rinsed and ready for the next stage. Margaret carried the basket of wet laundry outside to the yard. The clothesline was a length of hemp rope strung between 2 oak trees. She hung each piece carefully, pulling the fabric taut so it would dry smoothly. Shirts were hung by the hem. Sheets were hung folded over the line. She used wooden clothespins that she had carved herself from birch branches. Each pin held the fabric in place against the wind. It took her 45 minutes to hang the first load. By 9:15 a.m., she was back inside, starting the second load. The colored cottons went into the same pot, but she did not boil them as long. Boiling caused dyes to run. Instead, she washed them in hot water that had cooled slightly, rubbed soap into the stains, and scrubbed them on the washboard with less pressure. The woolens were handled differently entirely. Wool could not be boiled or scrubbed without shrinking. Margaret washed woolens in lukewarm water with a gentle soap made from soft soap, a liquid soap that was less alkaline than the lye soap she used on cotton. She did not rub woolens on the washboard. She squeezed the soapy water through the fabric by hand, then rinsed them in cool water and rolled them in a clean cloth to press out the moisture. At 10:30 a.m., the second load was on the line. Margaret stopped to nurse her youngest child, who had been crying in the loft. She did not sit down. She stood in the kitchen, holding the baby with one arm and stirring the next pot with the other. Her husband came in from the field and ate a bowl of porridge that the 9-year-old had made. He did not offer to help. It was not considered appropriate for a man to do laundry, not in 1866, not in rural Pennsylvania, not in most of the Western world. The laundry was women's work. It was understood that way, accepted that way, enforced that way. At 11:30 a.m., Margaret began the third load. This was the heavy wash, the work trousers, the stained rags, the toweling that had been used to clean the chimney and the stable. These items were boiled for as long as it took to remove the grease and dirt. Some items had to be boiled twice. Margaret used a stronger soap mixture, adding a handful of soda ash to the water to cut through the grease. The smell was acrid. The steam rose into her face. The kitchen was hot, humid, and filled with the odor of boiling fabric and lye. By noon, she was sweating through her dress. She did not change. There was no time. At 1 p.m., the midday meal was served. Margaret ate standing at the counter. She did not sit at the table with her family. There was laundry to be moved, rinsed, wrung, and hung before the afternoon sun faded. The children were sent to bring in the dry laundry from the morning loads. The whites were stiff and rough, having dried in the sun without any fabric softener. Softeners did not exist. The stiffness was removed later with the next stage, the ironing. But that was not yet. For now, the dry laundry was folded and stacked in baskets, ready for the finishing work. At 2 p.m., Margaret began the ironing. This was not the ironing of the modern world, a quick press with a steam iron in front of the television. This was ironing with flat irons, also called sad irons, that weighed between 5 and 15 pounds each. The iron was a solid block of cast iron with a wooden handle. It had to be heated on the stove, then carried to the ironing board, used until it cooled, then returned to the stove to heat again. Margaret had 2 irons. While one was in use, the other was heating. The cycle repeated for hours. She set up the ironing board near the stove. The board was a wooden plank covered with a heavy linen pad. She sprinkled each piece of clothing with water from a bottle that had a cork with holes drilled into it. This dampened the fabric and made the wrinkles easier to press. She tested the iron by holding it near her cheek. If it radiated heat, it was ready. If it was too hot, it would scorch the fabric. If it was too cool, it would not remove the wrinkles. There was no thermostat. There was only experience. At 2:30 p.m., Margaret scorched a shirt collar. It was her husband's best Sunday shirt. A brown mark appeared on the white linen. She set the iron down and stared at it for a moment. Then she picked up the shirt, dipped the collar in cold water, and rubbed it with soap. The stain faded, but it did not disappear. She hung the shirt aside to be rewashed. That would add another hour to her day. She did not cry. She did not have the energy to cry. At 3 p.m., the children brought in the second load. The cottons were dry. Margaret stopped ironing to fold them and begin the starching process for the next batch. Starch was made from cornstarch or wheat flour mixed with water and boiled into a paste. Margaret dipped the shirt collars and cuffs into the starch mixture, then wrung them out and set them aside. Starch gave the fabric a crisp finish that was fashionable in the 1/8 but it also made ironing more difficult. The starch bonded to the fibers and required a hotter iron to press smooth. The risk of scorching increased with every pass. At 4 p.m., the third load came off the line. The heavy items were dry. Margaret folded the trousers and rags and set them aside. These did not need ironing. They were work clothes, but they still needed to be aired, folded, and stored properly to prevent mildew. She carried the baskets to the bedroom and arranged the folded items in the wardrobe. The room smelled of ash and soap and sun-dried linen. It was a clean smell, but not a pleasant one. It was the smell of labor. At 5 p.m., Margaret returned to the ironing. She had 4 shirts left, 2 sheets and 3 pillowcases. The pillowcases were the hardest. They had to be pressed flat without folding, then folded precisely into rectangles and pressed again. The sheets were even larger. Margaret had to fold them in half, then in half again, then press each section with the iron, moving the heavy metal across the fabric in long, slow strokes. The iron cooled quickly. She returned it to the stove every few minutes. The process was slow. The room was still hot. Her arms ached. At 6:30 p.m., the ironing was finished. Margaret set the last iron on the stove and sat down for the first time since the morning. She sat in a wooden chair near the window and looked out at the yard. The clothesline was empty, the baskets were full, the shirts were folded, the sheets were pressed, the laundry was done. She had been working for 14 hours and 30 minutes. She had boiled, scrubbed, rinsed, wrung, hung, dried, folded, starched, and ironed approximately 60 pounds of fabric. She had used 40 gallons of water that she carried from the well. She had burned 4 armloads of firewood. She had made her own soap. She had done it all without a machine, without electricity, without help. But this was only the surface of the story. What I have just described is the labor of one woman on one Monday in one farmhouse in Pennsylvania. But the experience of laundry in the 1/8 was not limited to rural homesteads. It was a universal task performed by women in cities, towns, villages, and farms across the Western world. It was performed by servants in wealthy households, by enslaved women in the American South, by immigrant women in tenements, by frontier women in cabins on the prairie. Each of these women faced the same basic challenge: how to transform dirty, sweat-stained, mud-caked fabric into clean, presentable clothing using only fire, water, soap, and muscle. What happened on that single Monday in June was not unusual. It was typical. It was the routine of millions of women for centuries. And yet, when we look back at it from the present, the sheer scale of the effort is hard to comprehend. We throw a load of laundry into a machine, press a button, and return an hour later to find clean, dry, folded clothes. The woman of the 1/8 would not have believed such a thing was possible. She would have called it magic. But it was not magic. It was the result of a transformation in technology, labor, and society that unfolded over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries. And the story of that transformation begins with understanding what laundry actually meant in the 1/8. What was Laundry Day? It was a full day of labor, usually once a week, dedicated entirely to washing, drying, and ironing the household's clothing and linens. It was the most physically demanding chore that women performed, bar none. It required strength, endurance, skill, and meticulous attention to detail. It involved hazardous materials, from boiling water to caustic soap to heavy irons. It was dangerous. Women suffered burns, cuts, and joint damage. They developed respiratory problems from inhaling steam and live fumes. They endured back pain from bending over washboards and pots. And they did all of this while also managing the rest of the household, caring for children, cooking meals, tending gardens, and performing countless other tasks. But why did laundry require so much work? The answer lies in the nature of the clothing and the environment in which people lived. In the 1/8, clothing was made from natural fibers: cotton, linen, wool, and silk. These fibers absorbed sweat, dirt, and body oils readily. They were not treated with stain repellents. They were not designed to be easy to clean. And people in the 1/8 wore multiple layers of clothing, even in summer. A typical man wore a linen undershirt, a cotton shirt, a wool vest, a wool coat, and trousers. A typical woman wore a cotton chemise, a corset, multiple petticoats, a dress, and an apron. All of these layers needed to be washed regularly, or at least as regularly as the household could manage. And then there was the environment. Most households in the 1/8 did not have running water. Water had to be carried from a well, a pump, a stream, or a communal tap. In cities, water was often delivered by cart, but it was expensive and not always clean. In rural areas, water came from natural sources that could be contaminated with bacteria, sediment, or animal waste. The water itself had to be filtered or boiled before it could be used for washing. Every gallon of water used in laundry was carried by hand. Every gallon was heated over a fire. Every gallon was lifted, poured, and disposed of by the woman doing the wash. And yet, despite all of this hardship, laundry was done. It was done every week. It was done without complaint, or at least without public complaint, because the alternative was unthinkable. Dirty clothing was not only uncomfortable, it was a social liability. In the 180s, cleanliness was closely tied to respectability. A woman whose family appeared in public with stained or rumpled clothing was judged harshly. She was seen as lazy, careless, or immoral. The pressure to maintain clean, pressed, presentable clothing was enormous, and the burden of meeting that pressure fell overwhelmingly on women. The systems that supported laundry in the 180s were not designed for efficiency. They were designed for survival. The tools were simple and unchanging. The methods were passed down from mother to daughter. The knowledge was oral and experiential. There were no instruction manuals, no YouTube tutorials, no laundry apps. There was only the washboard, the boiling pot, the lye soap, and the aching arms of the woman who used them. And yet within this world of limits, there were variations. Not every household performed laundry the same way. The wealthy hired laundresses. The very poor went without clean clothes. The enslaved women on southern plantations were forced to wash the clothing of the slave-holding family in addition to their own. In cities, commercial laundries began to appear in the mid-180s, offering a paid alternative to home washing. But these laundries were often dangerous workplaces, employing poor women for long hours at low wages. The conditions were grim. The work was the same, only the location had changed. The story of laundry in the 180s is not just a story about washing fabric. It is a story about who did the work, how they did it, and what the work cost them. It is a story about the physical toll of domestic labor. It is a story about the invisibility of that labor, the way it was taken for granted, undervalued, and dismissed as merely women's work. And it is a story about the slow, halting, uneven march of progress that eventually, over the course of several decades, began to change the way laundry was done. But that change did not come quickly, and it did not come easily. The first washing machines were invented in the mid-180s, but they were hand-cranked, inefficient, and expensive. Most households could not afford them. Most households did not have electricity to run them. Most households continued to do laundry the way Margaret O'Brien did, with fire, water, soap, and muscle, well into the 20th century. How could this have changed? And what finally did change it? Those questions lead us forward into the history of technology, labor, and domestic life. But before we go there, we need to understand what was at stake. We need to understand the weight of the work, the texture of the day, the feel of the fabric, the ache in the arms. We need to sit with Margaret O'Brien for a little longer, not because her story is extraordinary, but because it is ordinary. She was one of millions, and the work she did on that Monday in June shaped not only her life, but the lives of her children, her community, and the generations that came after her. The laundry was never just laundry. It was the physical expression of a whole system of domestic life, a system that demanded everything from the women who ran it and gave back almost nothing except clean clothes. At 6:23 on the morning of Monday, June the 8th, 1846, Mary Pierce of Concord, New Hampshire, lit the fire under her cast-iron wash boiler. She had been awake since 4:30. She had already fed the chickens, milked the cow, and carried 6 buckets of water from the spring at the edge of the property. The water was cold and clear, but it still had to be heated. The boiler held roughly 12 gallons. It would take nearly an hour to bring it to a rolling boil. While the water heated, Mary sorted the week's laundry by color and fabric. Whites went in one pile, light-colored cottons in another, heavy woolens and dark linens in a third. She checked each garment for stains. There was a rust-colored mark on her husband's shirt collar, sweat and dirt ground into the weave. She had to rub that with a bar of homemade lye soap before the boil even began. Everything seemed normal. This was the routine of every Monday for the past 17 years of her marriage. She had learned it from her mother, who had learned it from her grandmother. The steps did not change. The tools did not change. Only the bodies changed. growing older, more tired, more worn. What happened next was not unusual. By 7:15, Mary had placed the first batch of white linens into the boiling water. She used a long wooden paddle to agitate the fabric, pushing it down, stirring it around, keeping it submerged. The steam rose thick and humid into the kitchen. The smell of lye soap and boiling cotton filled the room. She leaned over the pot, her face inches from the scalding surface. Her hands were already red and cracked from the soap. She had to be careful not to let her sleeves dip into the water. Burns were common. The previous winter, a neighbor named Abigail Hart had tipped a boiling pot onto her own leg and had been laid up for 3 weeks with an infection that nearly killed her. At 8 o'clock, Mary removed the first batch with the paddle, using a pair of wooden tongs to lift the steaming fabric into a tub of cold, rinsed water. She wrung each piece by hand, twisting the fabric until her forearms ached. Then she dropped the rinsed linens into a second rinse tub. Then a third. 3 rinses were standard. Any less and the soap residue would stiffen the fabric and irritate the skin. Any more and she wasted water that had to be carried from the spring. At 9:20, she began the second batch, the lighter cottons. The water in the boiler had to be replenished and reheated. She added more water from the bucket, stoked the fire, and waited another 40 minutes for it to return to a boil. While she waited, she took the first batch outside to the clothesline. The line was a single rope tied between a post and a tree. She hung each piece carefully, smoothing wrinkles with her fingers, pinning the corners with wooden clothespins. The sun was already high. The air was warm. The line would be full by noon. At 10:15, she was back inside. The second batch was boiling. She stirred it, lifted it, rinsed it, wrung it. By 11, the whites and light cottons were all on the line. The heavy woolens and dark fabrics were up next, but wool required different treatment. Hot water would shrink it. So Mary used lukewarm water, almost cold, with a milder soap. She had to scrub the woolens on a washboard, a corrugated metal sheet set into a wooden frame. She pressed the wet fabric against the ridges, rubbed it back and forth, over and over. The motion worked the dirt out but also worked the skin off her knuckles. By the time the woolens were done, her fingers were raw and bleeding in 2 places. At 12:30, she stopped for dinner. Dinner was cold leftover bread and a piece of cheese eaten standing in the kitchen. She did not sit down. Sitting down would make it harder to get back up. The fire needed more wood. The rinsed water needed to be dumped and replaced. The first batch on the line was already dry and had to be taken down before the afternoon dew settled. She worked through the meal in a rhythm that did not stop. By 2 o'clock, all the laundry was washed, rinsed, wrung, and hung. Mary had carried roughly 40 gallons of water from the spring to the house. She had boiled at least 20 gallons. She had scrubbed, stirred, lifted, and wrung dozens of pounds of wet fabric. Her arms trembled, her back ached. Her hands were swollen, but the day was not done. The laundry now needed to be ironed. In the 1/800s, ironing was not the quick touch-up it is today. Fabric came off the line stiff and wrinkled. It had to be smoothed with heavy flat irons, also called sad irons, blocks of cast iron weighing between 5 and 10 pounds each. The irons were heated on the stove or in the fire, but they did not maintain heat for long. A typical household owned several irons. One was in use while the others were heating. The woman would work quickly, pressing a shirt or a dress for a minute or two before the iron cooled, then swapping it out for a hot one. The handle of the iron was also metal and could become dangerously hot. Women used thick cloth pads or gloves to grip it. Burns on the hands and forearms were routine. Mary began ironing at 3 o'clock. She had a padded board set on 2 chairs. She heated 3 irons on the stove. She worked in a cycle: pick up hot iron, press a garment for about 90 seconds, set the iron down, pick up the next hot iron, replace the cooled one on the stove. The stove consumed firewood steadily. The room grew hotter. Sweat ran down her face. She did not stop. What happened over the next 5 hours was not an emergency. It was not a disaster. It was the ordinary rhythm of domestic labor in the 19th century. Mary ironed her husband's shirts, her own dresses, her children's clothing, the tablecloth, the napkins, the pillowcases, the sheets. She ironed until the wrinkles were gone and the fabric was crisp. She checked each piece for missed spots. She folded them with precision. At 8 o'clock in the evening, she put the last folded garment into the linen press. The kitchen was still warm. The fire was dying. The wash boiler was scrubbed and put away. The irons were cooling on the stove. Mary's hands were stiff and sore. She sat down for the first time in nearly 15 hours. She had not stopped for more than a few minutes at a time. She had eaten one cold meal. She had drunk water from the dipper. She had spoken only a few words to her children. She had done what had to be done. How could this have been the standard? How did women endure this week after week, year after year? The answer lies partly in the nature of the times, partly in the structure of the household, and partly in the fact that there was no alternative. Laundry was not a choice. It was a necessity. And the work of laundry, like the work of cooking and cleaning and child-rearing, was assigned to women by custom, by law, and by economics. A woman who refused to do laundry or who did it poorly faced social punishment and family hardship. A man who helped with laundry was considered eccentric at best, emasculated at worst. The division of labor was rigid. But there was another layer to this story. Not all women did laundry the way Mary Pierce did. Some could not. Some were forced to. In the cities, a growing class of laundresses worked for wages. They washed other people's clothes in their own homes or in commercial steam laundries that began to appear in the 1850s and 1860s. These laundresses were almost always poor. They were often Irish immigrants or black women freed from slavery but still trapped in low-paying domestic work. They worked 12 to 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, for wages that barely covered rent and food. The conditions in commercial laundries were brutal. In 1864, a New York newspaper described a laundry on the Lower East Side as a steam-filled cellar where women labored in near darkness, breathing coal dust and soap fumes, their hands permanently swollen. The work was the same as Mary's, but the environment was worse. There was no spring. There was no fresh air. There was only the relentless demand for clean clothes from middle-class families who did not want to dirty their own hands. What investigators would later find, had anyone investigated, was that the health of these laundresses was destroyed within a few years. Respiratory infections, skin diseases, chronic pain, premature aging. The mortality rate among laundresses was higher than among many other trades, but there was no compensation, no safety regulation, no union. The work was invisible. The women who did it were invisible. They were simply part of the machinery of daily life. And yet within this system, there were moments of resilience. Women organized small cooperatives to share washboards and boilers. They taught each other shortcuts for removing stains, using lemon juice for rust and salt for blood. They developed techniques for managing the heat and the lifting. They passed down knowledge of which soap was gentlest and which wood burned hottest. The work was hard, but it was not mindless. It required experience and judgment. A woman who could do laundry well was respected in her community. Her skill was a form of expertise, even if it was never recognized as such. Now step back and consider the larger pattern. Laundry Day in the 1800s was not a single event. It was a recurring cycle, a weekly ordeal that shaped women's bodies, schedules, and identities. It consumed an entire day of an entire life. A woman who lived from age 20 to age 70 doing laundry once a week would spend roughly 2,500 days, nearly 7 full years of her life, washing, drying, and ironing. That time came out of sleep, out of rest, out of education, out of leisure. It came out of the possibility of doing anything else. What changed? That is the next part of the story. But understanding the scope of what laundry meant in the 1800s requires sitting with the weight of that repetition. It requires understanding that the invention of the washing machine in the late 19th century did not arrive suddenly. The first patent for a hand-cranked washing machine was issued in 1846, the same year Mary Pierce boiled her whites. But that machine was a wooden drum with a handle, requiring the same arm strength as a washboard, and it cost several dollars, a significant sum for a farm family. It did not catch on widely. Later models used gears and levers, but still demanded manual effort. Electric washing machines did not appear until the 1900s, and they were expensive, unreliable, and dangerous. They were also only available in homes with electricity, which in 1900 meant mostly urban households. Rural electrification did not reach most American farms until the 193s and 194s. Margaret O'Brien, the Pennsylvania farm wife mentioned earlier, likely did not own an electric washing machine until the late 194s, if she lived that long. So the transformation of laundry was not a single breakthrough. It was a slow, uneven shift across generations. It was also a shift in values. As labor-saving devices became available, the expectation of cleanliness rose. Clothes were washed more frequently. More clothes were owned. The workload did not necessarily decrease. It changed form, but the core reality remains. For most of the 19th century, laundry was a full day of labor, dangerous, exhausting, and inescapable. It was the work that made all other public life possible because it kept families presentable, and it was done almost entirely by women whose names history rarely records. At 9:15 in the evening on that same Monday, June the 8th, 1846, Mary Pierce sat in her kitchen. The fire was out. The irons were cold. The laundry was folded and stored. She reached for a small leather-bound notebook and wrote a single line. She wrote it in pencil, her hand cramped and unsteady. She wrote, "Wash done, ironed all, very tired. Tomorrow I must mend the children's stockings." Then she blew out the candle and climbed the stairs to bed. At 8:47 p.m. on the evening of March 16, 1865, a fire broke out at the commercial steam laundry on Franklin Street in Lower Manhattan. The building was a converted warehouse, 4 stories high, with wooden floors and narrow staircases. The laundry operated on the upper floors. The basement held the steam boilers. The fire started in the boiler room, where coal dust had accumulated around a leaking steam valve. The building had no fire escapes. The windows were barred to prevent theft. Inside, 23 women were working. They were Irish immigrants, most between the ages of 18 and 35. They earned between $3 and $5 per week, 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. The laundry served hotels and boarding houses in the surrounding blocks. The steam pressure was high that evening because a shipment of sheets from the Astor House Hotel had come in late, and the manager demanded completion before midnight. A gas lamp was knocked over in the basement. The coal dust ignited. The flame traveled along the floor and up the wooden walls. Within minutes, the entire basement was on fire. The women on the upper floors smelled smoke. The manager, a man named William Bergen, shouted for them to come down. But the stairwell was already filling with black smoke. The women tried to descend. Several collapsed on the stairs. Others ran to the windows and screamed for help. At 8:52 p.m., a policeman on patrol heard the screams and ran to the nearest fire alarm box. He pulled the lever. The fire department responded within 8 minutes. By then, the building was fully engulfed. The steam boilers exploded at 9:04 p.m., sending bricks and iron fragments into the street. The fire spread to the adjacent buildings. What happened? Rescue was almost impossible. The women trapped on the upper floors had no way out. Ladders only reached the second story. The third and fourth floors were unreachable. The fire department had no aerial ladder trucks in 186 They had hand-pumped engines and horse-drawn hose carts. The heat was intense. Bystanders watched as women appeared at windows, their clothes on fire. At 9:08 p.m., a woman jumped from the fourth floor. She died on impact. 2 more followed. Fires of this kind were not uncommon in commercial laundries. The combination of steam, wood, coal, and fabric created a lethal environment. Yet no building codes existed for laundry operations. The fire killed 14 women. 9 survived, but with severe burns and lung damage. None of the women had life insurance. The building was insured, but the payout went to the owner. The families of the dead received nothing. The manager was charged with manslaughter but acquitted. The jury said the fire was an accident and the women had assumed the risk of employment. How could this have been allowed to happen? The answer lies in the legal and social status of laundresses. In the mid-19th century, domestic labor and industrial laundry work were considered women's work, and women's work was viewed as temporary, unskilled, and inherently hazardous. The women themselves were seen as interchangeable. The labor market was flooded with immigrants and former slaves, so there was no shortage of workers willing to accept dangerous conditions. The concept of employer liability barely existed. The prevailing legal doctrine held that workers accepted the risks of their trade when they took the job. If a woman was burned, crushed, or poisoned, it was her own fault for working there. This attitude extended beyond the workplace. In homes across the country, the women doing laundry were equally unprotected. They carried water, lifted heavy tubs, breathed lint and mold spores, and developed chronic respiratory conditions. A study conducted in 1872 by the Massachusetts Bureau of Statistics of Labor found that laundresses had the highest rate of rheumatism, heart disease, and premature death of any occupation surveyed. The typical laundress died at age 42. The typical seamstress lived to 50. The typical farmer lived to 60. Yet the study was ignored. There were no regulations for domestic work. There were no workers' compensation programs. There was no union for laundresses. The women who did this work were often too exhausted to organize. Their days began before dawn and ended after dark. They had no time for meetings, no money for dues, no political representation. Their labor was the invisible foundation of a society that could not function without clean clothes but refused to acknowledge the cost. By the 1880s, steam laundries had spread to most American cities. The process became more industrial. Clothes were sorted by color and fabric. They were soaked in vats of boiling water and lye soap. They were passed through mangles, heavy rollers that squeezed out water and flattened the fabric. The mangles were dangerous. Women lost fingers and hands when their sleeves caught in the gears. The machines had no guards. There were no safety interlocks. An operator who was tired or distracted could be pulled into the rollers. In 1892, a laundry in Chicago reported that in the previous year, 12 women had been severely injured by mangles. 6 of them were permanently disabled. The laundry paid each woman a lump sum of $50 and terminated her employment. The injured women returned to their families or to charity homes. What investigators later found, when social reformers began to document these conditions in the early 1900s, was that the injury rate in commercial laundries was 3 times higher than in textile factories. The fatality rate from burns and explosions was higher than in coal mining, when adjusted for hours worked. But coal mining was a male occupation, and miners had unions. Laundresses had no voice. The reform movement that emerged in the Progressive Era did eventually bring change. In 1911, after the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire killed 146 garment workers, public outrage led to new fire safety laws in New York. Those laws applied to factories, but laundries were often classified as non-factory workplaces and exempted. It took another 2 decades for basic safety standards to cover laundries. Meanwhile, the work continued at home. The women who did laundry in their own kitchens were spared the industrial hazards of the steam laundry, but they faced their own dangers. The heat from the stove caused dehydration and heat stroke in summer. The lifting of wet clothing led to back injuries and hernias. The constant contact with lye soap caused disfiguring dermatitis. The inhalation of coal smoke and lint caused lung disease. And the work was never done. The laundry cycle had no end. The clothes that were clean on Monday would be dirty by Friday. The bedding washed this week would need washing again next week. The diapers of an infant, washed every day, consumed hours that could not be recovered. But there was a change coming, and it was not technological. It was demographic. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the number of women working outside the home, especially in factories and offices, increased. These women still did laundry, but they could no longer afford to spend an entire day on it. They needed solutions. The commercial laundry industry grew to meet that demand. By 1900 in cities, a majority of middle-class families sent their laundry out. The women who could afford it paid others to do the work. The women who could not afford it continued to do laundry themselves. They were the wives of laborers, small farmers, and recent immigrants. They lived in tenements with no running water. They carried water from public hydrants up 3 or 4 flights of stairs. They boiled water on coal stoves in rooms that had no ventilation. They hung laundry on lines strung across alleys, between fire escapes, over rooftops. The work was as hard as it had been in Mary Pierce's time. And yet, by 1910, the first electric washing machines were being advertised. They were expensive, costing about $150, equivalent to a month's wages for a working man. They required a dedicated electrical circuit and a grounded outlet. They were heavy, made of cast iron and copper. They often leaked. They vibrated across the floor. They could catch fire if the motor overheated. But they worked. A woman could load the machine, add soap, turn a handle or press a pedal, and the machine would agitate the clothes. She could then drain the soapy water, put in rinse water, and repeat. The wringer, now electric, could squeeze the water from a sheet in seconds. The time spent on laundry dropped from 12 hours to about 4. This was a revolution, but it was slow. In 1920, only about 30% of American homes had electricity. Of those, only about 15% had a washing machine. The power grid expanded in the 193's rows through the Rural Electrification Act, but many farms did not get electricity until the 194's. And even then, the women who got the machines still had to carry water, still had to heat it, still had to hang the clothes. The machine did not eliminate the lifting or the bending or the heat. It only reduced the time. The deeper change came in the 195's, when automatic washing machines, combined with permanent press fabrics and electric dryers, transformed the day of laundry into a few hours of machine operation. But that is a later story. In the 180's and well into the early 190's, laundry day remained what it had always been. A full day of labor, physically demanding, socially invisible, and economically essential. So when we ask what happened to women like Mary Pierce, the answer is that most of them simply endured. They did not record their suffering in letters or diaries. They did not protest. They did what their mothers had done and what their daughters would do until the world changed around them. But some did record it. In the archive of the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, there is a letter written in 1879 by a woman named Sarah Miller, a laundress in Philadelphia. She wrote to her sister about a day's work. I started at 5 in the morning. I washed 14 shirts, 12 collars, 6 sheets, 8 pillowcases, and a pile of towels. I boiled them all, I rubbed them all, I rinsed them twice, I wrung them out, I hung them on the line. At noon I came inside and ate a piece of bread. At 2 I took them down, I started ironing at 3, I finished at 9. My hands are cracked and bleeding, my back aches, but the lady of the house said the collars were not stiff enough. She will not pay me until next week. I have no money for coal, my children are cold, I do not know what to do. Sarah Miller's story did not reach any official record. Her letter was preserved by accident. She died 2 years later of pneumonia, exacerbated by exhaustion. Her children were sent to the almshouse. Her life was a footnote in the economic history of the city. This is the pattern that investigators, had they existed, would have found. A system of labor that extracted health, time, and life itself from women who had no power to refuse it. The system was upheld by custom, enforced by poverty, and justified by the belief that women's work was natural and therefore not worthy of protection. And yet, within that system, women found ways to survive. They formed informal networks. They shared washboards and irons. They traded recipes for removing stains. They kept each other's children while one woman did laundry. They lent money when a boiler broke. They created a community of mutual aid that the official records ignored. At 9:15 p.m. on that same Monday, June the 8th, 1846, Mary Pierce had written her brief diary entry and climbed the stairs to bed. She slept deeply. She knew that tomorrow she would mend stockings, but that was a lighter task. She knew that the following Monday the cycle would begin again. She did not expect it to change. She did not hope for a machine. She did not dream of an electric washer. She lived in a world where laundry was the work of her life, and she did it without complaint because there was no one to hear her. What Mary did not know was that in 1846, the same year she boiled her whites, a patent had been filed for a hand-cranked washing machine. She did not see it. She would not see one for decades. The world was changing, but the change came too slowly for her. She was part of a generation that carried the burden of laundry across an entire lifetime, generation after generation, until the burden was finally lifted by technology and social transformation that arrived long after they were gone. This is what Laundry Day meant in the 1/8 It meant work that broke the body and consumed the hours and left no mark on history. It meant women like Mary Pierce and Sarah Miller, who lived and labored and died without recognition. It meant a system of invisible labor that made cleanliness possible for those who could afford to pay others to do the lifting, the boiling, the scrubbing. It was not an accident. It was not a failure of policy. It was the ordinary, accepted, expected order of things. And that is why it still matters. Consider the events of October 12, 1892, in Chicago. At 7:15 that evening, the night shift at the South Side Steam Laundry had just begun. The building was a 4-story brick structure on Wabash Avenue, built in 1878. It housed 40 washing machines, 20 mangles, and a steam boiler that supplied heat and pressure to the entire operation. The laundry employed 130 workers, mostly women and girls between the ages of 14 and 30. Many were immigrants from Germany, Ireland, and Poland. They worked 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week. The pay was $4 a week for women, $3 for girls. There were no breaks. There was no ventilation. The windows were sealed to keep out dust. At 7:22, a foreman named John O'Connell noticed a smell of gas near the boiler room. He walked to the basement. The boiler was a horizontal return tubular model built by the Babcock and Wilcox Company. It had been installed in 1/8. The pressure gauge read 110 pounds per square inch, below the rated maximum of 130. But the safety valve had been wired shut 6 months earlier after it began leaking. O'Connell knew this. He had been told to ignore it. The owner, a man named Henry D. Ames, had decided that the cost of replacing the valve was too high. The valve had been disabled with a piece of iron wire, a common practice in small factories and laundries across the city. At 7:25, O'Connell reported the smell to the boiler operator, a man named Peter Schmidt. Schmidt was 51 years old, a German immigrant, and had worked in the laundry for 12 years. He knew the boiler was dangerous. He had complained about the valve multiple times. He had been told to keep quiet or find another job. He checked the water level. It was low. He opened the feed valve. Nothing happened. The feed pump was stuck. Schmidt signaled O'Connell to help. They tried to manually operate the pump, but the handle was seized. At 7:28, the boiler emitted a high-pitched whine. The sound was new. Schmidt recognized it as metal fatigue. He shouted for everyone to evacuate. The workers in the basement heard him. The women on the first and second floors did not. The building had no alarm system. There was no whistle. There was no bell. The only way to communicate was by shouting, and the noise of the machinery drowned out all but the loudest cries. At 7:31, the boiler exploded. The blast blew the basement wall outward into the alley. The boiler's firebox ruptured, releasing superheated steam and boiling water into the laundry floor above. The temperature of the steam was approximately 300 degrees Fahrenheit. The water was not liquid but a froth of steam and scalding liquid. The explosion lifted the first floor off its foundation. The second and third floors collapsed into the basement. The mangles and washing machines fell through the gaps. The gas lines ignited. A fire began. At 7:33, the fire department received the first call. It came from a saloon across the street. The operator recorded the time. A full engine company responded from the station at Dearborn and Polk, 2 miles away. The streets were crowded with horse-drawn carriages and pedestrians. The engine arrived at 7:41. By then, the fire had spread to the second floor. The front of the building was partially open. Rescuers could see the bodies of women pinned under machinery. The heat was intense. The smoke was black and thick, filled with the chemical smell of burning starch and lye. At 7:46, the chief ordered a second alarm. By then, the fire had reached the third floor. The roof collapsed at 7:53. The building was a total loss. The fire was extinguished at 9:12 that night. The official count was 34 dead, 62 injured, but the true number was higher. Some workers had simply vanished. Their bodies were never recovered. The records kept by the laundry were incomplete. Many workers had been paid in cash. Their names never entered in any ledger. The dead included 17 women between the ages of 15 and 22. The youngest was Maria Kowalski, age 14, a Polish immigrant who had started work the week before. She had lied about her age to get the job. Her body was identified by a piece of green ribbon in her hair. What happened in the aftermath revealed the systems that failed. The Cook County Coroner's inquest began on October 14th. The coroner, a man named William L.G. Smith, subpoenaed Henry D. Ames, the owner. Ames testified that he had no knowledge of the disabled safety valve. He said he had trusted his foreman and boiler operator to maintain the equipment. He said the boiler had been inspected by the insurance company only 6 months earlier. The insurance inspector, when called, testified that he had given the boiler a routine visual inspection and approved it. He had not tested the safety valve because it was not part of his standard procedure. The inquest committee examined the wreckage. They found the wire that had disabled the valve. It was still attached. They found the feed pump, seized by corrosion. They found that the water supply line to the boiler had been blocked by debris. They found that the boiler's pressure gauge was broken, showing a reading of 110 pounds, but the actual pressure at the time of the explosion was estimated at 150 pounds, well above the safe limit. They found that the boiler had not been cleaned in 2 years. The interior was lined with scale, which reduced heat transfer and caused the metal to overheat. The inquest concluded that the explosion was caused by gross negligence. The safety valve had been deliberately disabled. The water supply had been neglected. The operator had no formal training. The owner had ignored multiple warnings, but the legal system offered no remedy. The laws in Illinois at the time required only that boilers be inspected by a state-appointed inspector. There was no requirement for periodic testing. There was no requirement for training of operators. There was no requirement for fire alarms, evacuation plans, or fire drills in commercial laundries. The victims' families could sue for damages, but most were too poor to afford a lawyer. Henry D. Ames was charged with manslaughter. The trial began in January 1893. He was acquitted after a jury deliberated for 2 hours. The judge instructed the jury that negligence alone was not enough to convict. There had to be proof of willful intent to cause harm. No such proof was found. The boiler explosion in Chicago was not an isolated incident. Between 1880 and 1900, at least 212 boiler explosions were recorded in the United States. 172 of them occurred in factories and laundries. The majority involved disabled safety valves. The reason was simple. Safety valves reduced pressure by venting steam, which reduced efficiency and increased fuel costs. Owners disabled them to save money. The workers paid the price. But the explosion also highlighted a deeper failure. The women who worked in steam laundries had no union. They had no political representation. They could not vote. They could not speak at public hearings. Their deaths were recorded in the newspapers as a tragedy, but the tragedy was framed as an accident, not as a predictable outcome of a system designed to extract maximum labor at minimum cost. Investigators later reviewed the records of the South Side Steam Laundry. They found that the average tenure of a female worker was 18 months. The turnover was constant. Women left because of injury, illness, or exhaustion. They were replaced by new immigrants willing to accept any wage. The company had no retirement fund, no sick leave, no compensation for injuries. A woman who lost a hand in a mangle was fired the same day. Her wages were stopped. She received nothing. The system that failed these women was maintained by custom and enforced by poverty. The same system that made Mary Pierce's laundry day a full day of labor also made Maria Kowalska's death a footnote in the record of industrial expansion. The inquiry asked how the explosion could have happened. The answer was straightforward: because the system allowed it. The safety valve was disabled because the law did not require it to be functional. The building had no fire alarm because no law required one. The workers were not trained because no law required training. The owner was acquitted because the legal definition of intent was narrow. And yet, the disaster did produce change. The Chicago City Council passed an ordinance in 1893 requiring annual inspections of all steam boilers in commercial buildings. The state of Illinois followed with a boiler inspection law in 1895. The National Board of Boiler and Pressure Vessel Inspectors was formed in 1909. But these reforms came too late for the women who died on October 12, 1892. They came too late for the generations of laundresses who had been maimed and killed before the laws were written. The deeper significance of this event is that it represents the ordinary, invisible cost of laundry in the 1/8 The work did not only break bodies slowly over years of lifting and boiling. It also killed quickly when machines failed, when buildings burned, when safety was traded for profit. The women who did this work were not protected because they were not valued. Their labor was considered natural, unskilled, and replaceable. The system that exploited them was not an anomaly. It was the standard. So when we consider the question of what Laundry Day meant in the 1/8 we must include these deaths. They are part of the story. They are not separate from the diary entry of Mary Pierce or the letter of Sarah Miller. They are the same story, told in a different register. The explosion at the South Side Steam Laundry is a reminder that the invisible labor of laundry was not only exhausting, it was deadly. And the death was not accidental. It was built into the system. The fire was put out. The bodies were buried. The insurance company paid a settlement to Henry D. Ames, not to the families. The laundry was rebuilt larger with a new boiler and a new safety valve. The doors opened again in 1894. The women came back. They had no other choice. The cycle continued. The work of laundry, whether done in a kitchen or a factory, remained the same work. Heavy, wet, hot, endless. The women remained the same, poor, immigrant, unprotected. The only thing that changed was the date. On the morning of September 14, 1895, at precisely 6:42 a.m., a boiler exploded at the Riverside Steam Laundry in Detroit, Michigan. The building was a 3-story brick structure built in 1888. It employed 142 workers, 109 of them women. The morning shift had started 20 minutes earlier. The boiler had been under fire since 5:30, building pressure for the day's work. At 6:42, the cast iron shell of the main boiler split along a vertical seam. The escaping steam expanded instantly, lifting the entire roof of the boiler room and collapsing 2 interior walls. The explosion was heard 6 blocks away. 23 people were killed. 47 were injured, many with steam burns that did not heal. What happened in the seconds after the rupture was documented by the Detroit Fire Department. The boiler room had no emergency shutoff. The steam lines feeding the presses and mangles were still under pressure when the building began to collapse. Women working on the second floor had no escape route. The only staircase was directly above the boiler room. It was destroyed. Survivors reported jumping from windows onto the street below. One woman, Mary Donovan, age 19, broke her legs when she landed on a delivery wagon. She died 3 days later from internal bleeding. Another, Anna Schmidt, age 22, was pinned under a falling press. She was rescued after 2 hours but died of sepsis 10 days later. Investigators from the Michigan State Engineering Commission arrived on September 16th. They examined the boiler fragments. They found that the safety valve had been wired shut. The wire was identical to the one found in Chicago 3 years earlier. The boiler had a cracked water gauge, which made accurate readings impossible. The foreman, a man named James O'Connor, admitted that he had not checked the water level that morning. He said he had assumed it was full. The water supply pump had been broken for 8 days. O'Connor had ordered workers to carry buckets of water from a cistern in the yard to fill the boiler by hand. On the morning of the explosion, the water level was dangerously low. The boiler overheated. The metal expanded beyond its design limits. The rupture followed. The inquest in Detroit lasted 2 weeks. The owner, William H. Powers, testified that he had no knowledge of the disabled safety valve. He said he had instructed O'Connor to maintain the equipment. He said the boiler had been inspected by the insurance company in January 1895. The insurance inspector, when called, admitted that he had spent only 15 minutes at the laundry. He had not removed the valve cover. He had not tested the pressure gauge. He had signed the inspection certificate without raising any concern. The inquest committee found that the inspection was worthless. The system of self-regulation had failed again. Powers was charged with criminal negligence. His trial began in December 1895. He was acquitted after the jury deliberated for 4 hours. The judge,